When a wealthy businessman boarded a private charter, the first thing he noticed wasn't the luxury of the jet or the comfort of the cabin. It was the pilot. He took one look at the black man in uniform and scoffed. Loud enough for others to hear, he sneered. "No way you're flying my plane. You people don't belong in that cockpit." What he didn't know was that the pilot had spent over 20 years in the U.S. military, logging thousands of flight hours in combat zones, training other pilots and earning medals for his service. And by the end of that flight, the arrogant man who thought money made him superior would learn the hard truth. Prejudice has no wings, but experience always soars. Captain Marcus Reed had spent more than half his life in the air. To him, flying wasn't just a job, it was second nature, something as natural as breathing. He had logged thousands of hours during his 20-year career in the Air Force, piloting everything from fighter jets to massive transport planes that carried soldiers and supplies into combat zones. He had landed on short runways in dangerous weather, navigated through storms in the dead of night, and taught countless younger pilots how to handle themselves in the cockpit. For Marcus, stepping into the cockpit of a sleek private charter was routine. But for the man boarding that day, Marcus's presence was anything but acceptable. The passenger was Charles Whitman, a real estate mogul known as much for his wealth as for his arrogance. He walked onto the tarmac in a tailored suit and expensive sunglasses, trailed by an assistant carrying his luggage. Everything about him screamed entitlement. The crew exchanged polite nods, but Charles barely acknowledged them, too busy scrolling on his phone. When he finally looked up and saw Marcus standing near the steps of the plane, ready to welcome him aboard, his expression shifted instantly. Surprise flashed across his face, followed by irritation. He stopped in his tracks, squinting as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You're the pilot?" Charles asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. Marcus gave a calm nod. "Yes, sir. Captain Reed. I'll be flying you to Miami today. The flight should be smooth and on time." Charles let out a short, mocking laugh. "You're kidding me. They're letting you fly this plane?" Marcus kept his composure. He had dealt with comments like this before, though it never got easier. "Yes, sir. I've been flying for over 2 decades. You're in good hands." But Charles wasn't convinced. He looked around, as if expecting someone else to appear. Perhaps a pilot who fit his narrow idea of what a pilot should look like. His assistant shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing her boss would lower his voice. But Charles pressed on. "Look," Charles said loudly, gesturing toward Marcus. "I don't know what kind of operation this is, but I didn't pay top dollar for some—" He stopped short, biting back a word that would have left no doubt about his prejudice. "For someone inexperienced." Marcus didn't flinch. "Sir, I assure you I'm more than qualified. If you'd like, I can share my credentials with you." Charles smirked, clearly enjoying the attention he was drawing. "Oh, I'd love to see those. Because from where I'm standing, this doesn't look right. I've flown plenty of times, and I've never seen someone like you in the cockpit." That was the moment the other passengers started paying closer attention. A couple already seated inside peeked out the cabin door, curious about the commotion. One of the flight attendants stepped closer, her polite smile tightening as she tried to de-escalate. "Mr. Whitman," she said softly, "Captain Reed is one of our most experienced pilots. You'll be safe with him, I promise." But Charles waved her off. "Safe? How do I know that?" "Look, I've worked too hard for my money to end up in some second-rate situation. I want another pilot." Marcus took a slow breath, steadying himself. Years of military training had taught him patience under pressure, but the sting of such blatant disrespect still cut deep. He glanced at the other passengers, some of whom were watching uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed by Charles's behavior. "Sir," Marcus said evenly, "there is no other pilot. I'm the one assigned to this flight. If you'd like, you're free to cancel and make other arrangements. But if you're flying with us, I'll be your captain." The firmness in his voice carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around them. For a moment, Charles just stared at him, sizing him up, perhaps waiting for Marcus to break under the pressure. But Marcus didn't break. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his presence radiating calm authority. Finally, Charles let out a scoff and shook his head. "Unbelievable. Fine. But if anything goes wrong up there, it's on you." He stomped past Marcus and up the stairs, muttering under his breath. "What a joke," Marcus exhaled quietly, then climbed into the cockpit. He'd dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. Charles hadn't just doubted him. He had dismissed him entirely, not because of his skills, but because of who he was. Still, Marcus refused to let anger dictate his actions. He had a job to do, and he would do it flawlessly as always. Inside the cabin, the tension lingered. Charles dropped into his seat with exaggerated annoyance, barking orders at his assistant about his schedule. The other passengers avoided looking at him, their discomfort plain. Some glanced at Marcus as he walked by, offering small, supportive nods, but no one dared speak against Charles directly. Marcus strapped into the cockpit, his hands moving through the pre-flight checklist with precision. Switches clicked, gauges flickered, and the hum of the engines soon filled the air. He tuned out Charles's voice, which carried faintly from the cabin, and focused on the controls. Flying was his sanctuary, his place of mastery, and nothing, not even prejudice, could take that away. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Marcus's mind briefly drifted to his years in the Air Force. He remembered the long missions over hostile terrain, the split-second decisions that saved lives, the young recruits who had looked up to him for guidance. Compared to those moments, ferrying a wealthy businessman to Miami was simple, almost too simple. But what wasn't simple was the sting of being doubted yet again. He had thought that after 2 decades of service, after medals and honors, after proving himself again and again, he would no longer have to justify his worth. And yet here he was, facing the same ugly skepticism. He tightened his grip on the controls and pushed forward. The engines roared, the plane surged down the runway, and with a steady pull, they lifted into the sky. For Marcus, the air always told the truth. Up there, above the noise and prejudice of the world, it didn't matter what anyone thought. It only mattered what he could do, and he could fly. Better than most, better than Charles would ever realize. What Marcus didn't know yet was that this flight would test his patience more than most, because Charles wasn't finished, and his arrogance was about to reach new heights. The first hour of the flight should have been uneventful. The engines purred smoothly, the sky was clear, and the cabin crew moved quietly, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Most people settled into their seats with laptops or magazines, content to let the hours pass. But Charles Whitman wasn't content. He shifted constantly in his leather seat, sighing loudly, tapping his fingers on the armrest as though the very act of sitting still was beneath him. Every so often his voice rose above the hum of the cabin, cutting through the calm with yet another jab directed toward Marcus. At one point, he leaned toward his assistant and said loudly enough for the flight attendant to hear, "I can't believe this. You pay for a private charter, and this is what you get? Some guy who looks like he should be driving a cab, not flying a jet." The assistant winced, her cheeks reddening. She glanced nervously toward the cockpit door, as if praying Marcus hadn't heard. But Marcus had. Pilots notice everything in their cabins, even when their eyes are on the controls. Still, Marcus kept his focus steady. He knew the altitude, the heading, the wind speeds. He had memorized every detail of the route. Years of training had taught him discipline. No distraction, no matter how offensive, could pull him away from the responsibility of keeping lives safe. Yet Charles wasn't finished. When the flight attendant came by to collect empty glasses, Charles stopped her. "Excuse me, can I speak to whoever's in charge?" "Not the waiter here," he said with a sneer, motioning toward Marcus's closed cockpit door. "I mean the real pilot." The attendant's polite smile faltered. "Sir, Captain Reed is in charge. He is the pilot," Charles chuckled, shaking his head. "That's what they want you to think. But let's be real here. I don't feel comfortable. I've got millions riding on deals waiting for me in Miami, and I'm supposed to trust my life to this experiment?" The woman held her ground, though her patience was thinning. "Sir, Captain Reed is one of our most experienced pilots. You are safe." Charles leaned back, rolling his eyes. "We'll see about that. If we land in one piece, maybe I'll write a thank you card." Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy looks. A man across the aisle muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." A woman traveling with her daughter pulled her child's headphones tighter, as if shielding her from the ugliness spilling from Charles's mouth. Back in the cockpit, Marcus stayed locked in. He had flown in far worse conditions, with gunfire in the distance, with equipment failures, with enemy radar lighting up his screens. Compared to those days, this was calm. But what weighed on him now was different. It wasn't danger in the sky, it was hostility in the cabin. And while he couldn't control Charles's words, he could control how he responded, with silence, professionalism, and skill. Still, Marcus wasn't blind to the power of perception. He knew every sneer from Charles chipped away at the atmosphere of the flight, and he knew that at some point, words had to be answered. But he waited, letting time work in his favor. Midway through the journey, as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Charles decided to press his attack further. He got up, ignoring the seatbelt sign, and walked toward the cockpit door. The flight attendant quickly intercepted him. "Sir, you need to remain seated. It's not safe to approach the cockpit during flight." Charles brushed her aside with a dismissive wave. "Don't lecture me about safety. I want to see him." I want to know exactly what kind of training this guy has. Because I don't buy it. The attendant stood firm, blocking the door. Mr. Whitman, please sit down. Captain Reed is busy flying this plane. If you have questions, you can ask when we land. Charles smirked. Busy? Probably reading the manual, trying to figure out which button does what. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Even his assistant tugged at his sleeve, whispering, Please, sit down. You're making a scene. But Charles thrived on scenes. He raised his voice. I'm not going to sit here quietly while my safety's at risk. I paid for this flight, and I deserve answers. The cockpit door remained closed, Marcus inside, calm as ever. But through the intercom, his voice finally came, firm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're cruising smoothly at altitude. I ask everyone to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Safety is our top priority, and I assure you this flight is operating exactly as planned. The message was short, professional, and unmistakably authoritative. It reminded everyone, including Charles, that Marcus was in command, whether they liked it or not. Charles scowled but returned to his seat, grumbling under his breath. We'll see how this goes. If we make it to Miami, maybe I'll consider it a miracle. The rest of the passengers exchanged looks, some sympathetic toward Marcus, others visibly irritated at Charles's antics. But Marcus didn't let it rattle him. His eyes stayed on the horizon, his hands steady on the controls. Inside, though, a quiet determination grew. He had endured worse insults in his career, but he had also learned that patience had its moment. And soon enough, the perfect opportunity to silence Charles once and for all would arrive. Not with anger, but with truth. Because Marcus's resume wasn't just impressive, it was extraordinary. And when the time came to lay it out, even Charles would have no choice but to reckon with it. For now, Marcus flew on, letting the steady hum of the engines drown out the noise of arrogance in the cabin. But storms, both literal and figurative, were on the horizon, and they would prove, beyond a doubt, who truly belonged in the cockpit. By the time the flight entered its final stretch, the tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. Most passengers tried to tune Charles out, burying themselves in books or closing their eyes with headphones on, but his voice, loud and smug, cut through everything. He seemed determined to make sure no one forgot how little faith he had in the man flying the plane. He leaned back in his seat, swirling the ice in his glass of bourbon. You know, he said loudly to no one in particular, I've been on dozens of private flights. Dozens. And I can tell you right now, this is the first time I've ever felt nervous. Call it instinct. Call it common sense. But I don't care what anyone says. I don't believe that guy knows what he's doing. The flight attendant, clearly at the end of her patience, muttered, Captain Reed has more experience than any pilot we've ever had on staff. Charles chuckled, shaking his head. Experience? Yeah, sure. He probably flew a crop duster once or twice. Doesn't mean he belongs in the cockpit of a $20 million jet. This time, another passenger couldn't stay silent. A man in a business suit, seated a few rows back, leaned forward and said sharply, With all due respect, sir, some of us would like to enjoy this flight in peace. You're being disrespectful. Charles turned, his smirk widening. Disrespectful? I'm protecting my investment here. You think I'm going to trust my life to someone just because he looks confident? Please. Money doesn't make me stupid. The businessman shot back. No, but your mouth makes you sound that way. Laughter rippled through the cabin, quiet but unmistakable. Charles's face reddened. He slammed his glass down and stood up, marching toward the cockpit again. The flight attendant rushed to intercept him, but this time Marcus's voice came through the intercom before she had to. Mr. Whitman, Marcus said, his tone steady but commanding. Please return to your seat. I'll be happy to answer your questions when we land. But Charles wasn't having it. No, we're going to settle this now. I want proof. I want to know exactly what qualifies you to fly this plane, because as far as I can tell, you don't belong up there. The cabin went silent. Every passenger turned their head toward the front. Even the assistant, mortified, buried her face in her hands. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, the cockpit door opened with a hiss, and Marcus stepped out. He still wore his headset around his neck, his uniform crisp, his posture calm but undeniably authoritative. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The way he carried himself commanded attention. You want proof? Marcus said, his eyes fixed on Charles. Fine. Let me tell you exactly who's flying this plane. He took a step closer, his voice clear and measured. I served 20 years in the United States Air Force. I've logged over 8,000 flight hours in more types of aircraft than you can name. I've flown combat missions overseas. I've landed under fire, and I've taught younger pilots how to stay alive in the sky. I've been decorated with service medals for missions you wouldn't survive a minute in. And after retiring with honor, I chose to continue doing what I love, flying. So yes, Mr. Whitman, I belong in that cockpit. I've earned it more times than I can count. The words hit like a hammer. The passengers sat frozen, their eyes wide, their respect for Marcus deepening with every sentence. Even the flight attendants, who already knew he was experienced, seemed moved by the weight of his history. Charles, on the other hand, looked stunned. His mouth opened slightly, as though searching for a comeback, but nothing came out. His arrogance, so loud just moments ago, had been silenced by a simple truth. He had no idea who he was talking to. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't sneer. He simply straightened his shoulders and said, "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a plane to land, and for your sake, I suggest you let me do my job." He turned, re-entered the cockpit, and closed the door behind him. For a moment, the cabin remained silent. Then, the businessman in the back said firmly, "That's what respect looks like." A few passengers clapped softly, their appreciation genuine, their admiration clear. Charles sank back into his seat, his face pale. He picked up his glass, but his hands shook too much to drink. For once he had no words. The man who spent his life believing money bought him authority had been outclassed entirely, not by wealth, but by experience, discipline, and dignity. In the cockpit, Marcus adjusted his headset and calmly resumed his checklist for descent. His heart rate hadn't spiked. His hands were steady. To him, putting Charles in his place hadn't been about ego. It had been about defending his honor, his craft, and every young pilot who might one day face the same ignorance. The passengers settled back into their seats. The cabin's atmosphere transformed. Where there had been tension, now there was quiet respect. Even the flight attendants walked with lighter steps, pride in their captain shining in their eyes. Charles, meanwhile, sat in silence. For a man who thrived on control, the realization stung deeply. In the air, he wasn't in control. He was at the mercy of the very man he had doubted. And that man was more capable than he would ever be. But fate wasn't done with him yet, because as the jet neared Miami, a pocket of turbulence awaited. And in that moment, Charles would learn, in the most visceral way possible, just how wrong he had been. The Miami coastline was less than an hour away when the first signs of trouble appeared on Marcus's radar. A storm system had formed faster than predicted, its edges brushing against the flight path. Dark clouds massed ahead, and lightning flickered in the distance like warning signals from the heavens. Marcus had flown through worse. To him, this was routine, a challenge to be managed with precision. He adjusted the controls, calculated a slight course correction, and calmly alerted the crew over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering a patch of weather ahead. Nothing unusual, but you may feel some turbulence. Please remain seated with your belts fastened. We'll be through it shortly." Passengers nodded, buckled up, and returned to their books or naps. Everyone trusted him now. Everyone except Charles. The moment the plane began to dip and shudder, Charles's head snapped up. His knuckles tightened around the armrests as the jet bounced lightly in the currents. "What's happening?" he barked, his voice sharp with panic. The flight attendant, calm as ever, said, "Just turbulence, sir. It's perfectly normal." "Normal?" Charles nearly shouted. "This doesn't feel normal!" "We're shaking like a toy. Are you sure he knows what he's doing up there?" The businessman across the aisle groaned. "For God's sake, sit down and let the man fly." But Charles couldn't. His bravado, so loud earlier, dissolved the second nature reminded him how fragile he was in the sky. The jet bounced again, slightly harder this time, and he cursed under his breath, sweat glistening on his forehead. Inside the cockpit, Marcus remained steady. His hands guided the yoke with measured precision, his eyes scanning the instruments while his instincts drew on years of training. He spoke quietly to the co-pilot, adjusting altitude to smooth the ride. To him, turbulence wasn't fear. It was math, timing, and control. Back in the cabin, Charles leaned forward in his seat, muttering like a man losing faith in gravity itself. His assistant whispered, "Please calm down. He has it under control." Charles shook his head wildly. "You don't know that! You don't know what he's doing!" At that very moment, Marcus's voice came over the intercom again, calm and reassuring. "We've adjusted our altitude to minimize turbulence. You may feel some bumps for the next 15 minutes, but everything is under control." His tone was confident, almost soothing. The passengers visibly relaxed. Even the little girl with headphones looked unfazed, swinging her legs to the rhythm of the bumps like it was a game. But Charles clung to his fear. Every drop in altitude made him gasp. Every vibration sent him gripping tighter at the seat. His arrogance had collapsed into raw panic, and everyone could see it. The businessman across the aisle finally muttered, "Funny how the guy who didn't believe in the pilot is the one panicking the most." A chuckle rolled through the cabin. It wasn't cruel, but it was telling. Charles flushed red but said nothing. His voice, once booming, was gone. Meanwhile, Marcus adjusted again, steering the jet around the heaviest pocket of the storm. He thought briefly of his days in the Air Force, flying through combat zones where the turbulence wasn't weather but explosions nearby. Compared to that, this was child's play. He smiled faintly at the irony. The storm had given him exactly what Charles needed. Proof not through words, but through skill. After a few more minutes, the bumps smoothed out. The clouds thinned. The horizon ahead opened, bathed in the orange glow of a Miami sunset. The passengers applauded softly, not out of habit, but from genuine relief and gratitude. And in the middle of it all sat Charles Whitman, pale, sweaty, and silent. He hadn't been silenced by Marcus's words this time, but by his actions. The pilot he had doubted, mocked, and dismissed had just carried him safely through a storm. The intercom clicked again. Marcus's voice came, steady as always. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've cleared the weather. We'll be descending into Miami shortly. Thank you for your patience." The cabin erupted in murmurs of relief. Passengers smiled, exchanging looks of respect for the man behind the door. Even the assistant leaned back with a visible sigh of gratitude, though she avoided Charles's eyes. Charles himself slumped low in his seat, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in his life, perhaps, he realized that money couldn't buy him control in every situation. Up here, 35,000 feet above the earth, the only thing that mattered was skill, and the man he had mocked possessed it in spades. As the jet descended smoothly toward Miami, Charles remained quiet. He didn't sip his drink. He didn't boast. He didn't complain. He sat in silence, humbled in a way that no deal, no fortune, no social circle had ever humbled him before. And for Marcus, that silence was victory enough. He didn't need applause. He didn't need to put Charles in his place with more words. He had already done it the best way possible, by flying the plane with precision and dignity when it mattered most. When the wheels touched down on the Miami runway with a gentle thud, the cabin filled with soft claps again. Passengers looked relieved and grateful. Marcus's voice came one last time. "Welcome to Miami. Thank you for flying with us." Charles remained seated as others began to collect their belongings. He glanced once toward the cockpit door, then quickly away. His arrogance had been stripped down to its core, leaving nothing but the quiet sting of embarrassment. For the rest of the passengers, though the lesson was clear, respect isn't about appearances, titles, or wealth. Respect is earned through actions, and Marcus had just given them a masterclass in what true professionalism looked like. As the jet rolled to a stop on the private runway in Miami, the passengers began gathering their belongings, still chatting about the storm and praising the smooth landing. Their voices carried an undertone of relief, but also respect. Every single one of them knew they had been in the hands of a professional. The flight attendant opened the door to the cockpit, and Marcus stepped out, his uniform as sharp and his demeanor as calm as it had been at takeoff. He offered a polite smile to the passengers as he thanked them for flying. His presence alone drew quiet nods of admiration. The businessman who had defended him earlier walked up, shaking his hand firmly. "Captain Reed, that was some of the best flying I've ever seen. You made it look easy." Marcus gave a humble nod. "Just doing my job, sir." Others followed, some offering thanks, some giving small claps on the shoulder as they walked past him. Even the little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, he's like a superhero." Marcus crouched slightly, smiling at her. Not a superhero, just someone who loves to fly. One by one, the passengers disembarked, their respect clear. Everyone except Charles. Charles lingered in his seat, staring down at the floor as though trying to make himself invisible. His assistant urged him quietly, "We should go." He finally stood, moving stiffly toward the exit, avoiding Marcus's eyes. When he reached the door, Marcus stood aside, holding it open. Their eyes met for just a second. There was no gloating in Marcus's gaze, no smug satisfaction, just quiet strength, the kind that spoke louder than words. Charles swallowed hard, muttered something under his breath that sounded vaguely like "thank you," and hurried down the steps without looking back. His assistant gave Marcus an apologetic look and followed. Marcus let them go. He didn't need an apology. The truth had already played out in the skies above. Once the passengers were gone, Marcus returned to his cockpit, finishing his post-flight checklist with the same precision he brought to every mission. To him, this flight was just another day's work, but to those who had witnessed it, it was unforgettable. In the terminal, Charles was quieter than anyone had ever seen him. For the first time, he had no story to spin, no clever retort to mask his discomfort. His assistant tried to lighten the mood with small talk, but he brushed her off. He had been exposed, not by confrontation, but by competence, and the sting of it clung to him. The other passengers, however, left with a very different feeling. They had seen a man belittled for the color of his skin, only to rise above it with unshakable skill and dignity. They carried that lesson with them as they left, shaking their heads at Charles's arrogance and smiling at Marcus's composure. As for Marcus, he walked off the runway with the same calm stride he had walked onto it. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need validation. His life had been filled with proving himself in tougher places to tougher audiences. To him, this was just another reminder that character always outlasts prejudice. That evening, Charles sat at a Miami hotel bar, nursing a drink. He replayed the storm in his head, the helpless feeling of being tossed around while the man he had doubted kept the jet steady. He replayed Marcus's words about 20 years of military service, about combat missions and medals, and for the first time, he admitted to himself, quietly, privately, that he had been wrong. But Marcus didn't waste a thought on Charles. By the time Charles was brooding over his drink, Marcus was already reviewing his next flight plan, ready to get back in the sky where he belonged, because men like Charles lived for control. But men like Marcus lived for purpose. And in the end, purpose always soared higher than arrogance ever could.